Okay, now we're going to start talking about Chapter 14, which is basically when good immune systems go bad. We're going to be talking about disorders of immunity. So our learning outcomes for section 14.1 are the definition of immunopathology and describing the two major categories of immune dysfunction. And then the second thing we're going to do is identify the four major categories of hypersensitivities or overreactions to antigens. Okay, so the immune response is basically a double-edged sword. It is an incredibly powerful tool that our body has to be able to fight off any kind of pathogen that wants to set up shop in our body. But it has the potential to cause severe pain, injury, and disease in our body if it goes haywire, if it loses the ability to differentiate something that is self versus something that is not self. And sometimes it's just simply something that's really uncomfortable, like hay fever. I'm not downplaying hay fever. I have it. It's miserable, all kinds of nasty side effects and symptoms, but it's not going to kill you, as opposed to anaphylaxis, which will in fact kill you. It can be extremely severe. And it can be incredibly painful, for example, rheumatoid arthritis, where people's joints swell up and they can't walk and they can't grab hold of anything. It's a very debilitating kind of disease. And then lots of other things. Asthma is also an inappropriate immune response, usually tied to seasonal allergies or some kind of an allergic reaction to some substance. Diabetes also is an autoimmune disease where autoantibodies kill off the islet cells in the pancreas, and therefore the body is no longer capable of producing insulin. And graft rejection, which of course is where we do in fact have foreign material in our body, which the immune system correctly recognizes, but we don't want it to kill off the organ that we just had implanted into our body to replace one that failed. Okay, so the term immunopathology is the study of disease states associated with the overreaction or underreaction of the immune system. So overreaction is referred to as hypersensitivity. And typically that would be an allergy or an autoimmune type of disease, where tissues are attacked or tissues overrespond to normal immunologic functions that have lost the ability to distinguish between self and non-self in the case of autoimmunity, or something that's dangerous versus something that isn't, as in the case of allergy. So pollen, by and large, is not dangerous, but if you have hay fever, your body doesn't know that anymore. Hyposensitivity, on the other hand, is where the immune system is not able to mount an attack against a real pathogen because it's been incompletely developed, perhaps based on a genetic defect. It's been suppressed either by drugs or by a disease, or it's been destroyed. So for example, somebody who has leukemia, often they will irradiate the bone marrow to stop overproducing those white blood cells, but in the process they kill off the immune system as well. And unless you replace that bone marrow, you're going to basically lose the ability to fight off any kind of disease. So again, let's talk about those classes, those two basic types of disorders of the immune system. So on the top, we have hyposensitivities, and we're going to talk about that in a later section. So I'm just going to talk briefly about these two things. So primary immunodeficiency is a genetic defect where you're not able to produce B or T cells. So this is an example of a boy in the bubble who has a disease called SCID, which we're going to talk about in great detail later on in this chapter. Secondary immunodeficiency is caused by a disease, so AIDS is a good example of that, where you're no longer able to properly mount an immune response because essentially all of your T cells have been killed off by a virus. Hypersensitivities, where the immune system overreacts, is what we're going to talk about in the rest of this particular section. So type 1 is an immediate response, and examples of that would be hay fever as a less severe example, and anaphylaxis as a more severe example. Type 2 would be an antibody-mediated allergic response, and an example of that would be an improper blood transfusion. So you have a blood type incompatibility, and your immune system is going to attack that. Type 3 is an immune complex issue, and that would be something like rheumatoid arthritis or serum sickness. And type 4 tends to be more long-term, and that tends to be cell-mediated. So here's where the T cells are getting involved and killing something that we don't want it to kill. And so contact dermatitis would be a less severe example of that. It's very uncomfortable, but generally speaking, you don't die from contact dermatitis, whereas graft rejection, you possibly could. So it can indeed be very severe. Okay, so these are the 4 types in more detail. So type 1 is immediate hypersensitivity, and it's what we commonly think of when we talk about an allergy. It's IgE mediated, so that's those longer types of antibodies that are produced. It involves mast cells and basophils, and those are the 2 types of white blood cell that are involved in those allergic reactions. And generally what they do is they release inflammatory cytokines, which then cause inflammation in the target tissues. So anaphylaxis is a severe example of that. Hay fever is the uncomfortable example of that, but hay fever sometimes can lead to asthma. So a lot of people who have seasonal allergies also have seasonal asthma that goes along with that, because their respiratory tract is hyperreacting to all of those cytokines that are released as part of that hay fever. So type 2 is antibody mediated, and these are not IgE mediated responses. These are IgG. So this is really a more classic immune response. So it's releasing IgM and IgG, and it is attacking those host cells. Okay, and generally speaking, they call in complement and poke holes in those cells, and so you end up with lysis and therefore dead tissue. And this is a case where a lot of autoimmune diseases fall into this category. So blood group incompatibility, if you have a bad transfusion; pernicious anemia, where your red blood cells are getting attacked by your immune system; and myasthenia gravis as another example of antibody-mediated hypersensitivity. Type 3 is an immune complex, and this is also antibody mediated. Typically, it's IgG mediated as opposed to the more classic allergic response, which would be IgE mediated. But in this case, the IgG is doing that cross-linking thing. So this is an appropriate immune response when you're trying to deal with pathogens. So those IgGs are grabbing onto one cell, and then they're grabbing onto another cell, and they're clumping everything together. Well, if these are not appropriate cells to be clumped together, you can end up with things that block things that shouldn't be, like, kidneys would be one thing when it's trying to deal with getting rid of these immune complexes, and you start blocking all of the entrances to those um, uh, areas in the kidney where the urine is being processed, where the things are being pulled out of the blood and processed in the urine, then it's going to shut down the kidneys, and it can get very, very severe. And so in this case, lupus is one of the immune complex mediated autoimmune diseases. Rheumatoid arthritis is another example. Rheumatic fever, which is a sequelae of strep throat, of streptococcus group A strep infections. And then type 4 is a T cell mediated hyper response to some kind of an allergen. And this one tends to be more delayed. It tends to be more long-term. And generally, it's because you have a cytotoxic reaction, and so you have those cytotoxic T cells that are going in and killing off parts of your tissue. So again, this is often an autoimmune type of disease. And here you have graft rejection, you have hyper severe infection reactions. So contact dermatitis is a less severe version of this particular type of hyper response. Okay, so the concept check at the end of section 14.1, which of the following is not a result of an abnormal or undesirable immune function? And in this case, the answer would be D, fever. That's actually a normal part of the immune response. And unless the fever gets too high, it's actually extremely helpful in terms of dealing with some kind of an infection. Okay, so section 14.2. We're going to summarize genetic and environmental factors that influence the development of allergies. We're going to identify 3 conditions caused by IgE-mediated allergic reactions. We're going to identify the 2 clinical forms of anaphylaxis, and that's the really severe response, and explaining why one of them is usually more fatal than the other. And then we're going to list the 3 main ways to either prevent or short circuit those type 1 allergic reactions. Okay, so here are some terms that we need to describe before we move forward talking about this. So an allergy is an exaggerated immune response that's manifested by inflammation. So this is an inflammatory response. Some tissue is becoming inflamed because of the response to whatever this allergen is. And just an allergen is something that should be an innocuous substance like pollen. However, it induces that allergy in individuals who are sensitized to that particular allergen. So atopy is a chronic local allergy like hay fever or asthma. Okay, so it's something that occurs locally. So even though asthma is severe, it occurs in the lungs and in particular in the bronchi and bronchioles, so a particular portion of the lungs, as opposed to anaphylaxis, which is a systemic, sometimes fatal response, typically involving the obstruction of the airway and the collapse of the circulatory system because of the chemical responses of the body to the cytokines that are released during an anaphylactic response. Okay, so in the US, about 50% of the population is affected by some kind of airborne allergen. So it can be dust, it can be pollen, it can be mold, it could be dust mite feces. So really good reason to change your pillow on a regular basis is you get that full of dust mites and yuck, it's got all kinds of bad stuff in there. So type 1 allergies in general are relatively mild. Now, that doesn't mean they're not uncomfortable, you know, having a really stuffy nose and a headache and all the other sorts of things that occur with hay fever. You know, again, it's not pleasant, but you're generally speaking not going to die from hay fever. Asthma and certain food allergies, on the other hand, can put you in the hospital and can lead to death if they're not properly treated. Some of these allergies can last for a lifetime. You are born essentially allergic and you will die allergic to that same thing. There are some allergies that appear to be outgrown. So you're allergic for a period of time and then your body kind of desensitizes itself to that particular allergen. And there are others that tend to develop later on in life. So, for example, I do have hay fever, and I didn't develop until I was in my 30s. I had no problem until my 30s. And actually, what happened was I moved to England for a year and became allergic to some things in England that I had never been exposed to. And then when I came back to the United States, similar things caused allergies. And so I've sort of had hay fever ever since. Okay, so a generalized susceptibility to allergens is inherited, but not the allergy to the specific substance. That is something that has to be developed by an immune response. And we're going to sort of talk about that primary and secondary allergic response in a few slides. So the genetic basis for that atopic type of allergy, which is that localized kind of acute allergic response. You have increased IgE production. You have also increased reactivity of those mast cells, those cells that actually are the ones that produce those inflammatory cytokines. And you also often have an increased susceptibility of the target tissue. So in the case of asthma, if those bronchioles become hyper-responsive to those inflammatory cytokines, that's when they're going to hyperconstrict and cause that asthma symptom. So essentially, if your parents have allergies, you have about a 25% chance of being affected. However, the broader those allergies go in your family tree, so it goes up to about 50-50 if you have siblings or grandparents who also have allergies, okay? So the broader that goes in your family tree, the more likely it is that you will either have or develop allergies at some point in your life. Okay, so we sort of have been wondering why there seems to be an uptick in these allergic hypersensitive types of reactions. And there is something called the hygiene hypothesis. And basically the idea is that we have created a pretty hygienic world, which in many ways is a really good thing. We're not all dropping dead from cholera and other things that are passed with exposure to open feces. But on the other hand, maybe we've overdone it because part of the process of developing your immune system is being exposed in a fairly safe way to various different kinds of allergens. But if we have wiped everything down with antimicrobial substances and we've shut off all of the entrance points for allergens and other critters that get into our houses, then our immune systems don't get properly taught how to deal with dangerous things as opposed to non-dangerous things. Okay? And as an example, it's been shown that children who grow up on farms, and so they are exposed to all kinds of stuff. They get worms from the dog, they get, all kinds of microbes from, wrangling the goats and all that sort of thing. And so they generally have fewer allergies and less asthma. And conversely, children who are delivered by cesarean section, and so they do not go through the vaginal canal and they're not exposed to all that vaginal microflora. So if they're delivered by cesarean and there's a maternal history of allergy, they have an increased risk by about a factor of 8 to getting an allergy. So there seems to be a really important phase in our life where we just really need to get sick. We really need to be exposed to these pathogens. And if we are not, our immune system never quite recovers. Okay, so uh, breastfeeding. So you guys are mostly too young to have witnessed any of this, but there is a huge, huge push in hospitals to encourage all moms to breastfeed if they possibly can. And there are some really good reasons for that. Some people get a little bit militant about it, and maybe that's not so good, but there are really, really good reasons to breastfeed. And we've talked about some of those. So being able to establish the microbiome is really important, and the early milk, the colostrum, is really important to establish that microbiome. But in addition, you also are able to pass those antibodies, that passive immunity from the mom to the baby to be able to help fight off diseases that the mom has expressed antibodies for and is able to pass on to the infant. So, in addition, newborns who are breastfed for the first 4 months have a lower risk of asthma and eczema. Okay. And again, part of that is because all of these antibodies and all of these microbes are being passed to the infant and teaching that infant's immune system how to deal with microbes from the outside world. There are also cytokines and growth factors in human milk, and they're able to essentially train the baby's gut mucosa to induce tolerance to those allergens. And that's another really important thing, is to expose them at the right time and in the correct way to various different antigens. So there was something called the Human Microbiome Project, which basically studied various different microbiomes all over the body in thousands and thousands of people, to kind of figure out, well, what should our microbiome look like, on our skin, in our gut, in our genital areas, depending male or female. Um, all of these different, in our ear and our nose, all of these different sites that have different microbiota. And they discovered that there are about 600 species of bacteria that can be transferred to the infants through the breast milk. And this has an incredibly important role in developing that tolerance. So with all of those things together, you can sort of understand why some people get a little militant about breastfeeding. It is really good if it is possible. Some moms just simply cannot manage it for a variety of reasons. And of course, any baby that's adopted, the mom is not necessarily going to be able to produce breast milk. There are some adoptive moms who do take a series of hormone shots to actually allow their bodies to produce milk, and some are successful at doing that. And, this is why they would go through all of that discomfort, because it is so incredibly important for those babies to be able to have that microbiome established and all of these other benefits. Okay, so the nature of allergens, like every other antigen, they have certain kinds of characteristics. Proteins are stronger antigens and therefore stronger allergens than carbohydrates or fats or nucleic acids. We talked about haptens, which are those really, really small antigens that alone may not be able to elicit an immune response. But if you conjugate them to a larger thing, generally a protein, then that protein gives the hapten that weight that allows the immune system to recognize it. And then the hapten is the allergenic or the antigenic part. Well, in the case of allergy, it kind of works against us. That tiny, tiny hapten attached to a protein is going to cause that allergic reaction. And so anything, generally speaking, with a weight of less than 1,000 Daltons can form complexes with those carrier molecules and therefore become allergenic. Another thing that's highly allergenic are organic and inorganic chemicals. And by that, I'm not meaning without any kind of, sprays. I'm talking about carbon-based. So an organic chemical found in industrial and household products, cosmetics, foods, drugs, all of those kinds of things are often haptens. Fragrances are something that a lot of people are sensitive to. And, if you have a cosmetic with a fragrance in it, all of a sudden your face can get really red. And, the whole point of using a cosmetic is to not make you look, really puffy and horrible. So you definitely don't want something that you're going to react to in that way. But fragrances kind of fall into that category. Okay, so portals of entry of allergens are primarily the mucosa of the gut, so you generally eat it or you breathe it in the respiratory tract. And part of the reason is that these are thin, moist surfaces that are penetrable, because the job of the lungs is to do gas exchange, and the job of the gut is to digest and allow the absorption of food. And so these allergens are kind of taking advantage of these normal processes, and this is how you end up being, exposed to these allergens and how you end up reacting to them. So skin, again, is generally that intact surface, so that dry, tough keratin layer is not going to be very permeable. But if you have a break in the skin, then allergens can get in that way as well. Okay, so here are some examples. You can have inhalants that come in through the respiratory tract, things like pollen, dust, dander, fungal spores. You can have ingestants, things that you eat. So typically things that enter through the mouth, peanuts being a very strong example of that. Peanut allergies can be extremely hyper responsive and can cause an anaphylactic response. Injectants. So yes, you can be allergic to something that a doctor injects into you, like penicillin, but more likely in this category are things that sting. So typically Hymenoptera are an order of insects that are stinging. And so wasps and yellow jackets and bees and fire ants and all of those stinging insects are kind of in this group. And those, again, can be extremely strong allergic reactions, often anaphylactic. And then the last category is contactants, which are things that come through the skin. Generally speaking, they're a delayed type 4 response, but that's includes things like fragrances and latex is that kind of a response. So people who develop latex allergies, that's what's going on. Okay, so mast cells are located in most connective tissues, but they're in very high concentration in the lungs, in the skin, in the gastrointestinal tract, and in the genitourinary tract. And so you'll recognize the lungs and the GI tract as the primary portals of entry of these allergens. Well, part of the reason that they hyperreact is that there are so many of these mast cells available to basically do the allergic thing. So each of these mast cells carries between 30,000 and 100,000 receptors that bind to IgE. Okay, so that's the allergic antibody. And when those cell receptors bind to IgE, the response of the mast cell is to do a process called degranulation. And basically, all of those little vacuoles filled with those inflammatory response or cytokines are released from the mast cell all at once. So boom, you have this huge release of inflammatory cytokines in that local area. And the symptoms of an allergy are not caused directly by the allergen. It's caused by the immune system's response to that allergen. Okay, so those mast cell inflammatory cytokines are what actually cause what we recognize as an allergic response. Okay, so let's talk about some of these cytokines that come out of the mast cells. And you're going to see some common themes. And by the end of this, I think you'll see why, especially asthma, is an immediate response to some of these cytokines. Okay, so histamine is the most profuse and the fastest acting allergic mediator, which is why when we get allergies, usually first thing we take is an antihistamine because we want to block the effects of that histamine cytokine on our body. So the first thing it does is it constricts smooth muscle, which means those bronchi and bronchioles in the lungs are immediately affected. And it causes a constriction, a reduction in the volume of air that can get into the lungs. It also causes increased intestinal motility, which is why one response to an allergen can often be diarrhea, because it's going to basically wake up that gut and force it to hyper-respond and to become hypermodal. It relaxes vascular smooth muscle, so it basically is a vasodilator. Okay, dilates arterioles and venules, so those are those small blood vessels kind of out in the extremities. And it results in something called a wheal and flare reaction on the skin. And in a couple of slides, I'm going to show you a picture of that. So I'll leave the description to that slide when I have a picture. But itching is a common response to an allergic stimulus. And it also stimulates eosinophils, which is a different kind of white blood cell. And essentially, the eosinophils pile on. So you may have heard some recent commercials about eosinophil-mediated asthma. And that's a particular kind, and it's basically when the mast cells bring those eosinophils into the lungs, it can cause a very, very severe asthmatic reaction. The next one is called bradykinin. And again, prolonged smooth muscle contraction of the bronchioles. Again, dilation of blood vessels, increased capillary permeability, so plasma is able to leak out of the blood cells, so you end up with that inflammatory, swollen response. And it increases the mucus secretion, which is, during hay fever, one of the major symptoms that we have to deal with. Serotonin, again, very similar to histamine and bradykinin. Number 4 is leukotriene, which is basically that slow reacting substance involved in anaphylaxis. And again, it induces gradual contraction of smooth muscles, like in the lungs. It causes prolonged bronchospasms, so that's a really tight constriction of those bronchi. Vascular permeability, so again, the bronchi tighten and the blood vessels loosen and allow plasma to seep out of the blood vessels where it's supposed to be staying in, and increases mucus secretion as well. And it stimulates polymorphonuclear leukocytes. We don't really need to know much about those guys, so I'm not going to discuss that any further. The last of the cytokines produced by these mast cells are prostaglandins, and it also causes smooth muscle contraction. This actually is one of the cytokines that will cause uterine contractions during delivery. It tends to be uncomfortable, so it tends to be irritating those muscles to make them contract. Again, vasodilation, increased vascular permeability. In this case, you also get increased sensitivity to pain. And again, that has to do with that irritating effect of the prostaglandins. So bronchoconstriction, and generally speaking, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs or NSAIDs prevent the action of prostaglandins. So that's kind of the target molecule of, Tylenol and ibuprofen and all of those sorts of things. So we've talked about 5 different cytokines, and every one of them can cause bronchoconstriction and vasodilation. And so you can see when all of these cytokines together kind of pile on, you can have pretty big systemic effects. Okay, so I mentioned that you have, in the same way that you have a primary and secondary response to a pathogen as part of the adaptive immune system, and the secondary response is bigger and faster than the primary response, a similar kind of thing happens in allergies. So at some point in our lives, a T cell recognizes something. Let's use pollen as an example. It recognizes pollen as an antigen, okay, and for some reason decides it's dangerous and has to be dealt with. And so that T cell is going to activate a B cell and say, here's your allergen, and the B cell is going to make plasma cells, which are going to produce, ultimately, it's going to get around to that type switching and get to IgE types of antibodies. And those IgE are going to land on a mast cell, which essentially is going to function much like a memory cell does in T cell and B cell mediated immune responses. And so the next time that pollen shows up, you have got some mast cells primed to respond to that pollen as if it is dangerous. And so it's going to, the IgE plus that allergen is going to cause that mast cell to degranulate, release all of those different cytokines, and we're off to the races with an allergic response. And so these are the kinds of things that you would typically see in an allergic response. So most of those cytokines cause dilated blood vessels, and they constrict bronchioles. Okay, so you're going to have trouble breathing, and all of your tissues are going to be leaky, and so you're going to have fluid that's going to be leaking into places that it shouldn't. You're going to have that inflammation. Dilated blood vessels are implicated in a lot of headaches, particularly migraines. And so often a headache, at least, and sometimes up into a migraine type of a headache, are a side effect of allergic responses. Again, you're going to get that swollen tissue because of all of that leaky, all those leaky blood vessels. Some of them cause hypermotility in the gut, and so you may end up with diarrhea or vomiting, other issues with the intestines, and combination of decreased volume or decreased diameter of the bronchioles plus an increase in mucus production ends up causing blocked airways, and that's where it becomes a really critical situation where you reduce the volume and you increase the stuff in that space. It's a kind of a double whammy, which can basically cause a crisis of not being able to breathe. Okay, so the term hay fever is really a generic term for something that we call allergic rhinitis, which basically is in the nose, you have a ton of that extra mucus and inflammation going on. Uh, Usually it's a seasonal reaction to something, either a plant pollen or a mold spore. It tends to be seasonal when those things are doing, in that part of their life cycle. But there are some people who have a chronic year-round reaction to pretty much any kind of airborne allergen or inhalant. These are primary respiratory membranes that are targeted, and typically it includes things like nasal congestion, sneezing, coughing, tons of mucus, itchy red eyes, and a minor bronchoconstriction, not necessarily where you would feel like you're not able to breathe, but it increases that coughing reflex. And so kind of between the extra mucus and the reduced volume in the airways, you're going to cough a little bit more frequently. Okay, whereas asthma is basically all of that bronchoconstriction comes together to reduce the ability to breathe to the point that it can become life-threatening. So oftentimes the airways become hyper-responsive to those cytokines, and they become sensitive to very small amounts of inhalants. And once those inhalants are in there, the tissue hyperreacts. And so you can sometimes have asthma, which is just a lot of coughing or a little bit of labored breathing, or you can actually suffocate if the symptoms get bad enough. Often there are rales, which are basically clicking, bubbling, rattling sounds in the lungs that you can hear if you use a stethoscope. And it has a very distinctive sound to let you know that that's what's going on in the lungs. So typically, the lungs become overreactive to two of those cytokines, leukotrienes and serotonin. And then sometimes they start to bring in natural killer cells and actually begin to cause some tissue damage. And again, that can be a permanent sort of a thing. Okay, so atopic dermatitis is another type of allergic reaction, and this is really itchy, inflammatory skin condition. Typically, sensitization occurs through ingestion or inhalation or skin contact with allergens. Often it begins in infancy and it's characterized by reddened, encrusted skin lesions on the face, scalp, neck, and inner surfaces of the limbs and the trunk, so like under the arms. And often it progresses to dry, scaly, thickened skin conditions in adults. These lesions are painful, they're itchy, and because it's no longer intact skin, you have a predisposition to secondary bacterial infections. So there's my hay fever acting up a little bit. Okay, food allergies. The most common food allergens come from peanuts, fish, milk, eggs, shellfish, and soybeans. In all these cases, the mode of entry is eating, okay? And symptoms often include vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. Sometimes you end up with hives. You can have a mucus reaction, so you have rhinitis, asthma, and in some cases, particularly things like peanuts and shellfish, for people who are very sensitive, you can end up with an anaphylactic response. And in this case, the hypersensitivity involves IgE and a degranulation of the mast cells, but not all of them use that mechanism. Okay, so anybody who has an egg allergy cannot have a vaccine that was produced in eggs. And so that's one of the things that you need to be very, very careful of, because they will have a very severe allergic response to that vaccine. Okay, drug allergies. So a lot of penicillin compounds are really allergenic to certain people who are particularly sensitive to that. So it's actually one of the most common side effects of treatment, and 5 to 10% of hospitalized patients can react badly to some kind of a drug. And it can be anything between a rash and anaphylaxis, depending on how sensitive they are. So penicillin is a very big contributor to this kind of a situation. Sulfa drugs are also highly allergenic. Aspirin for certain people, um, opiates, which obviously they have other issues as well as allergic response, but there are some people who are highly allergic to opiates. And contrast dye that are used in x-rays and CT scans and MRIs and things like that. Um, so my mom was highly allergic to contrast. She had one, she really reacted to it, and they basically told her if she ever had a second exposure to that contrast dye, it would probably cause anaphylaxis and kill her. So that was something she had to deal with for most of her life. And again, the allergen is not the intact drug itself, but typically it's a hapten that is given off when that drug is processed in the liver. So typically the liver will take these drugs and break them up into smaller pieces in the process of removing them from the body. But those haptens can conjugate with proteins and become highly allergenic. Okay, so anaphylaxis is a very swift and severe reaction to allergens. So there are a number of different types of anaphylactic responses. So one of them is a skin-based anaphylactic response, and that's cutaneous anaphylaxis. And here that wheel and flare inflammatory response happens to some kind of a local injection. And I believe it's the next slide that will show you a picture of that. Systemic anaphylaxis is typically a response that either completely shuts down the lungs, it bronchoconstricts to the point that you can't get sufficient air into your lungs, or it can cause the collapse of the circulatory system. And the circulatory collapse, it can be fatal within minutes. Um, and again,